They thought it would be a simple funeral, just a quick service, a few crocodile tears, and then the inheritance money. But when the coffin was lowered and the priest prepared for the final prayer, a sealed envelope appeared in the lawyer's hand. The old woman they had abandoned, Grandma Eleanor, had left one last message, and as her final words were read aloud, faces turned pale, secrets spilled, lies were exposed. By the time the last line was spoken, the very people who thought they'd gained everything were left humiliated, disgraced, and utterly destroyed. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering, "Did she know all along?" But before that explosive moment at the funeral, before that letter cracked open the truth, there was a story of love given freely and betrayal returned in kind. To understand the devastation that shook an entire family, we must go back. Back to the quiet house at the edge of town, where Eleanor Whitmore, 81 years old, spent her days in silence. Once, her home was full of life. Children running through hallways, Sunday dinners filling the air with laughter, photographs proudly displayed on the mantelpiece. But now, the rooms echoed with emptiness. Eleanor would sit at the window, eyes fixed on the winding road, waiting for a car that never came. Her son Richard had promised to visit soon. Her daughter Claire always had excuses. "Next month, Mom, I swear." And her youngest, Daniel, answered calls only when money was mentioned. She wasn't forgotten. She was ignored. In warm kitchens far away from her, conversations about Eleanor weren't about her health or her loneliness. They were about her estate. Richard's wife Monica was blunt. "She's getting old, Rich. It's only a matter of time. Do you even realize how much she's worth?" The house, the savings, the land, it could change everything for us. Richard fidgeted in his chair. "She's my mother." "She's a burden," Monica shot back. "We've been patient long enough." Daniel took his share in handouts. "Claire's been scheming too. What about us?" Meanwhile, across town, Claire was telling her husband the same thing. "When she's gone, everything will finally make sense. Just keep being nice on the phone. She doesn't want much, just words." Empty words. But Eleanor wasn't blind. In the evenings, she poured her thoughts into a leather-bound diary. At first, her notes were simple: aches in her legs, memories of her late husband, recipes she still remembered. But as months passed, her words grew heavier. "I waited all day by the window. Nobody came. Daniel asked for money again. I told him no. He hasn't spoken to me since. Claire sent a card. No visit. Just a card, parentheses. And then, late one night, in trembling script, they left me to die alone. But they forget, I still have a voice." Her only real companion was Margaret, the nurse who visited 3 times a week. Margaret listened to Eleanor's pain, brought her small comforts, and noticed that the old woman asked constantly for envelopes and stamps. "Writing letters?" Margaret once asked with a gentle smile. "Not just letters," Eleanor whispered. "Legacies." The truth was, Eleanor was planning something her children could never imagine. One rainy afternoon, Richard finally visited. He arrived not with flowers, not with groceries, not even with concern, but with documents. "Mom," he said, forcing a smile, "how are you feeling?" "Old, tired, lonely," Eleanor answered without looking away from the window. "You know, it might be wise to get some things in order. To make sure everything's handled properly when the time comes. I could help, with the paperwork." Her eyes narrowed. "You mean the will?" Richard chuckled nervously. "Not just that. Just planning." But Eleanor knew better. She saw the greed burning behind his eyes. She didn't argue. She didn't even confront him. She simply nodded and said, "Leave the papers. I'll think about it." That night, she wrote in her diary, "They think I am weak. They think I am theirs to control, but they don't know. The pen is still mine." Her 82nd birthday came and went. Not a single child showed up. Only Margaret brought a small bouquet of daisies. As they sat together, Eleanor reached across the table, her voice frail but steady. "Promise me something, Margaret. Promise that when I'm gone, my letter will be read at the funeral, no matter what they say." Margaret frowned. "A letter?" "Yes. The truth must be spoken. And I trust no one else." Margaret hesitated, but when she saw the tears brimming in Eleanor's eyes, she nodded. "I promise." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Good, because that letter will change everything." From then on, her strength dwindled. Her hands shook too much to write, so Margaret sometimes held the pen for her, carefully recording Eleanor's words. Not just a farewell, but a final act of justice. A letter forged in pain, sharpened into a weapon. By the last week, Eleanor could barely speak, but she whispered one last time to Margaret. They must hear it, every word, at the funeral. And then one cold night, the old house fell silent. Eleanor Whitmore had died, alone, but she hadn't died powerless, because her final letter still waited, sealed tight, ready to burn every mask her children had worn. And when it was read, it would destroy them. The news of Eleanor Whitmore's death spread quietly through the family, like a whisper nobody wanted to hear too loudly. Richard was the first to get the call from the hospital. He hung up, stood in silence for a moment, and then muttered under his breath, "Finally." He didn't cry. He didn't sit down in grief. He picked up the phone and called his wife. "She's gone," he said. Monica's voice didn't even flinch. "Then it's time to prepare. The funeral, the house, the will. Don't let Claire or Daniel outsmart you." Richard nodded. "They won't. This time I'll be ready." Across town, Claire received the same call. She pressed a hand to her chest, forcing out a shaky breath, but the tears refused to come. "I gave her years of my life. Now it's payback." But none of them, not one, paused to think about Eleanor herself. None of them asked about her final days, her loneliness, the silence in her house. Their thoughts were elsewhere. The will, the inheritance, the fortune they believed they had been cheated out of for too long. The funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday at the old church Eleanor had attended her whole life. A modest building with whitewashed walls, creaking wooden pews, and a bell that tolled slowly over the town square. Preparations began, but they were not preparations of love. Claire argued with Richard over the flowers. "They should be lilies," she insisted. "Roses," Richard snapped back. "It's what looks dignified." Daniel showed up late to the planning meeting, slouched in his chair, and muttered, "Why bother with all this? Just put her in the ground and get on with it." Their bickering filled the room, where once their mother's laughter had echoed. But behind the scenes, someone else was moving quietly. Margaret. The nurse. She hadn't been invited to the family meetings, but she had been given a duty far greater than choosing flowers or hymns. In her bag, carefully sealed, was Eleanor's letter, the very letter she had promised to deliver at the funeral. Margaret knew what it contained. She had helped Eleanor write some of it, and though she had never read it all, she had seen enough lines to understand. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a revelation. The day of the funeral came. The church bell tolled, the pews filled with distant relatives, neighbors, and curious townsfolk. People whispered about the old woman, about how sad it was she had died alone, about how her children should have done better. At the front, the coffin rested, draped in white cloth. A framed photograph of Eleanor stood beside it, her eyes bright, her smile warm, a face that had once given love so freely, now staring silently at the family who had turned away. Richard sat stiffly in the front row, his jaw clenched, his wife's hand gripping his arm. Claire dabbed her eyes with a tissue, though no tears came. Daniel leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, as if he were enduring a tedious chore. The service began. Hymns were sung. Verses were read. The priest spoke kindly of Eleanor's generosity, her devotion, her strength. But those words only seemed to echo louder in the silence of her children's hearts. They looked at the coffin, but what they really saw were numbers: land, property, savings. And then, just as the final prayer was about to be spoken, the air shifted. The lawyer, Mr. Bennet, an old friend of Eleanor's late husband, rose from his seat. He cleared his throat. "There is one last matter," he said, his voice carrying through the church. "Mrs. Whitmore left behind a letter. It was her wish that it be read here, aloud, before everyone." The family froze. Richard's head snapped up. Claire's hands tightened around her tissue. Daniel frowned. "A letter?" Richard asked sharply. "Is that really necessary? Surely such things can be handled privately." But Mr. Bennet shook his head. Her instructions were clear. This is to be read publicly, now. Gasps rippled through the pews. Guests leaned forward, curious. The children exchanged uneasy glances, but they couldn't stop it. The envelope was produced. Margaret, sitting quietly in the back row, closed her eyes. This was the moment. Mr. Bennet broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and began to read. "My dear children," the letter began. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Claire's lips parted slightly. Daniel scoffed. "If you are hearing this, then my body has already been laid to rest. You sit there now, in front of my coffin, pretending to mourn, while already wondering what I left behind for you. I know this, because I knew you." Murmurs rippled through the church. Guests glanced at each other, eyebrows raised. Eleanor's voice, though written, was alive in the room. Every word cut deeper. "For years, I waited by the window, hoping one of you would come. I cooked dinners that went cold. I wrapped gifts that were never opened. I dialed your numbers only to hear excuses. You left me in silence, day after day, year after year. I was not forgotten. I was abandoned." Claire covered her mouth. Richard's face flushed red. Daniel muttered under his breath, "Oh, for God's sake." But the lawyer continued, "You treated me not as a mother, but as an obstacle. An obstacle between you and what you thought was rightfully yours. You circled me like vultures, waiting for me to die, pretending to care only when it suited you. But do not think I was blind. I saw your greed. I felt your absence, and I wrote it all down." A chill filled the church. People were leaning forward now, hanging on every word. Eleanor's children sat frozen, their carefully crafted masks beginning to crack. And then came the line that made every jaw drop. "Each of you believes you will inherit from me, but what you do not yet know is that my estate is not yours to claim. By the time you hear this, the will has already been executed, and not in your favor." Gasps echoed. Richard's fists clenched. Claire's head spun. Daniel sat bolt upright. The letter wasn't just words. It was a blade, and it had only begun to cut. The church was still, the kind of silence that clung to the air, heavy, suffocating. All eyes were on the lawyer, Mr. Bennet, as he held the letter with trembling hands. Eleanor's words were not just being read, they were being resurrected. She was there in that room, scolding, exposing, condemning. The letter continued. Richard, my firstborn, the one I once believed would protect the family after your father died. Instead, you turned into a shadow of him, not in strength, but in selfishness. Do you remember the time I asked you to fix the roof? You promised you would, but you never came. Weeks passed, rain poured in, and when I called again, you said, "Why don't you just hire someone, Mom? I'm too busy." Too busy, Richard. Too busy waiting for me to die, perhaps. Gasps rang out. Richard's face burned crimson. He wanted to stand, to shout that it was a lie. But too many people in the pews remembered. The leaky roof. The ignored calls. They knew. The lawyer's voice grew steadier as he went on. And the money. How many times did you come to me with those forms? Sign this, Mom. It'll make things easier. Easier for whom, Richard? For me or for you, so you could tally up what you thought you would gain. I raised you with honesty, but you, my son, learn to smile while sharpening a knife behind your back. Richard's wife grabbed his arm, whispering harshly, "Stay seated. Don't make it worse." But the room already knew. His shame was carved into his face. The letter turned, now like a blade seeking its next victim. Claire, my only daughter, my little girl who once brought me flowers from the garden, who used to sit at my feet while I sewed. You could have been my comfort in old age, but instead you learned the art of excuses. Always a meeting, always an errand, always too busy to drive a mere 20 minutes to see your mother. You sent cards instead of visits. You sent words instead of presents. Do you know what I did with those cards, Claire? I stacked them in a drawer full of empty gestures. Claire's tissue slipped from her hand. She covered her face, shaking her head. The lawyer's voice grew sharper, Eleanor's words slicing clean through the silence. You like to present yourself to the world as the perfect mother, the perfect neighbor, the perfect friend. But perfection, Claire, begins at home. You fooled them all, but you did not fool me. Your children see a woman admired by many, but one day they will realize the truth. You abandoned your own. A murmur spread through the crowd. Claire's 2 teenage daughters, seated behind her, exchanged wide-eyed glances. One whispered, "Mom, is it true?" Claire's body stiffened, but she couldn't bring herself to look back. Then the letter turned one final time, toward the youngest, and Daniel, my baby, the boy I carried into this world when I thought I was too old to have another. I spoiled you, didn't I? I gave you more than I had given the others, because I was tired, because I wanted peace. And you took that kindness and twisted it into greed. Do you remember the last time you came to see me? You didn't ask how I was. You didn't even sit down. You only said, "Do you have money for me?" And when I told you no, you walked out and never returned. That was my gift from you, Daniel. Abandonment wrapped in entitlement. Daniel laughed bitterly, shaking his head, as whispers erupted around the church. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. But his voice trembled, betraying him. The lawyer's voice didn't waver. "You sold your love for coins, Daniel. And yet, you felt I owed you more. You bled me dry with your requests, and when the fountain ran out, so did you." Daniel's girlfriend shifted uncomfortably beside him. People stared. Some shook their heads. Some glared. Now the letter's tone shifted. No longer just exposing. It was building toward revelation. And so, my children, you sit there today, perhaps wondering what punishment I have chosen for you. Is it silence? Is it shame? No, it is justice. For every lonely night, for every unanswered call, for every birthday and holiday spent staring out a window, waiting for footsteps that never came, I have made my choice. The guests leaned forward. The children sat stiff, their eyes wide, their throats dry. My estate, everything your father and I built, is not yours. Not a penny, not a brick, not a blade of grass. For why should you inherit from a woman you could not even honor with your time? Why should you take when you gave nothing? The church exploded in whispers. The children's faces drained of color. Richard leaned forward, his voice rising in a hiss. What? That's not legal. That's not. Silence, Monica whispered, yanking his sleeve. But it was too late. The crowd had seen his panic. The lawyer cleared his throat, steadying the paper. My will has already been executed. Every possession, every account, every acre of land has been transferred, not to you, but to the one who truly stood by me, to the one who showed me kindness when my own children could not. My nurse, Margaret. A collective gasp shook the room. Heads turned. Dozens of eyes darted to the back row where Margaret sat frozen, her hands gripping her bag. Yes, Margaret, the woman you dismissed as a servant, the one you ignored when she walked past you at my house. She is the daughter I never had. She is the family you refused to be. And to her, I leave it all. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret looked pale, stunned, as whispers swirled around her. Some gasped in admiration, others in envy. But the loudest reaction came from the front row. Richard slammed his fist against the pew. This is outrageous. She can't do this. Claire's mouth fell open, her tears finally spilling. Daniel shot to his feet, his face red with rage. That woman, that stranger, she stole our inheritance. But the lawyer held up a hand, his voice firm. This was Eleanor's wish. Signed, sealed, and witnessed, and you will respect it. Because she knew, better than anyone, who truly loved her and who only waited for her to die. And then, the final lines of the letter, softer now, but cutting to the bone. My children, you will leave this church today with nothing in your hands but the weight of your choices. That is my final gift to you, the truth. I gave you life. I gave you love. And you gave me abandonment. May this be the inheritance you remember, long after the gold and the land are gone. Goodbye. The letter ended. The silence that followed was unbearable. Eleanor's coffin seemed to glow in the flickering candlelight, as if she herself were there, smiling faintly, victorious in her final act. Her children sat ruined, their reputations shredded, their greed laid bare for the entire town to see. And in the back row, Margaret wept quietly. She had not asked for this. But Eleanor had given her everything, not for greed, not for gain, but for love. The funeral was no longer about death. It had become a reckoning. The church doors closed behind the mourners, but the whispers followed into the streets. Eleanor's letter was all anyone could talk about. A mother who had left nothing to her own children, but everything to a nurse. It was scandal. It was justice. It was unforgettable. Outside, under the gray sky, Richard, Claire, and Daniel erupted. This is fraud, Richard shouted, his voice echoing off the church steps. She was old, she was confused, Margaret manipulated her. Claire spun on him, her tears now replaced with fury. Don't you dare blame Margaret. If anyone pushed her, it was you. All those papers you tried to make her sign, you poisoned her with your greed. Daniel scoffed bitterly. Look at the two of you, pretending to be saints. You weren't there for her any more than I was. At least I was honest about it. You played the good child while waiting for her to die. Neighbors stared, horrified, as the siblings tore into each other, their grief swallowed by rage. The mask of respectability had been ripped away, and now the whole town saw them for what they were. Scavengers who had circled a dying woman, only to be left with nothing. Meanwhile, Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, the letter still echoing in her mind. She hadn't wanted this. When Eleanor first mentioned leaving her the estate, Margaret had begged her not to. I don't need your money, she had whispered. I just want you to be comfortable. But Eleanor had shaken her head, her frail voice unwavering. It's not about money, it's about truth. My children abandoned me. You stayed. This is not reward, it is justice. Now, holding the weight of that justice, Margaret felt torn. She had gained everything, property, savings, land, but it came at the cost of Eleanor's children's wrath. And oh, how that wrath was boiling. In the weeks that followed, the Whitmore siblings' lives unraveled. Richard tried to challenge the will in court, claiming Eleanor had been manipulated. But the diary was produced, page after page of her own words, her loneliness, her bitterness, her plans. Every entry was a dagger to his case. The judge dismissed him swiftly, noting that Eleanor's state of mind had been clear. Claire found herself shunned by her neighbors. Once admired as the perfect woman, she now walked through town under a cloud of whispers. She abandoned her own mother, people muttered. Even her own children pulled away, asking questions she couldn't answer. Daniel spiraled the fastest. With no inheritance to fund his reckless life, he turned to old habits, gambling, drinking, debts. People who had once tolerated him now turned their backs. He was no longer Eleanor's son, heir to fortune. He was just Daniel, broke, bitter, and angry. And through it all, Eleanor's words haunted them. You will leave this church today with nothing in your hands but the weight of your choices. Every night, each of them heard those words. In the quiet, in the dark, they echoed like a curse. But Margaret carried Eleanor's legacy differently. She moved into the old stone house at the edge of town. At first it felt wrong, walking those creaking floors, sleeping in the bed Eleanor had once occupied. But soon the house filled with life again. She restored the garden Eleanor had loved. She cooked meals in the old kitchen. She even invited neighbors for Sunday dinners. The laughter and warmth returning after so many years of silence. In the evenings, Margaret sat by the window where Eleanor had once waited, diary in her lap. She read the entries slowly, tears filling her eyes. I waited all day by the window. Nobody came. They left me to die alone. But I still have a voice. Margaret whispered into the empty room. They hear you now, Eleanor. They'll never forget. Months passed, but the memory of the funeral did not fade. In the town, people still spoke of it. Do you remember what she did? The letter? It became legend, a story parents told their children as a warning. Never abandon the hands that raised you, for one day those hands may write the truth. For Richard, Claire, and Daniel, the story was worse than legend. It was their reality. Invitations stopped coming. Friends grew distant. Employers questioned their character. Their reputations had been destroyed. Not by scandalous gossip, but by their own mother's final words. They had dreamed of inheritance. What they inherited instead was shame. 1 year after the funeral, Margaret visited Eleanor's grave. She laid fresh daisies, just as she had brought her every birthday. She stood quietly, the breeze rustling through the trees, and spoke softly. "You did it, Eleanor. You spoke louder in death than they ever could in life. You showed them who you truly were, and who they truly are. And though they hate me for holding what you left behind, I promise you I will honor it. I will honor you." She placed her hand gently on the headstone. "Rest now. You won." And in that moment, under the quiet sky, it was clear. Eleanor Whitmore had not been silenced by loneliness, nor erased by abandonment. Her final letter had destroyed the greedy, uplifted the faithful, and etched her story into memory. She had left this world alone, yes, but she had the last word. And in the end, the last word was all she needed.